Yeah, not Death Shadows, and I'm going to pay life until I go down to 1 and attack you. It's Death Shadows, and, you know, along the way, I'll get Taxiing Probe and
yeah.
play a Breeding Pool untapped. It was definitely a working man's Death Shadow.
So Reanimator as a combo deck, this can be one of the tougher matchups for Maverick.
Definitely. You know, there's not a lot of interaction with the Graveyard game 1. Maverick is on the slow side, not much in the way of disruption, and Reanimator is ruthless when it comes to being these kind of decks. There are a couple dimensions that David has access to. The big one is Caracas. If he's able to get Night of the Reliquary into play, he has access to Caracas, and that's problematic because most of the creatures that Chris would want to reanimate are legendary.
And here's the other one, Deathrite Shaman. You see this as the turn 1 for play for David, gives him an angle of attack. Also, his 4 copies of Green Sun's Zenith can find the one of Scavenging Ooze in his deck, which is a third way for him to attack Reanimator. But David is going to have to be aggressive with the hate cards because racing Chris is pretty much out of the question.
Now, this is going to be where an interesting game settles in. If David knows what Chris is playing, forget that. The Deathrite Shaman's staying up. If David is unaware of what Chris is playing, it's important for Chris to conceal what he's playing for as long as possible. Turn 1 Island Ponder could mean a million different decks, from you know, Delver Strategies to Sneak and Show to Omniscience, etc. If David taps the Deathrite Shaman on his own turn to make mana, or taps low enough where the Deathrite Shaman can be activated, that's an opportunity for Chris to sneak something into play. So if David doesn't know what Chris is up to, it's really important for Chris to not give away what's going on, because if David pivots, starts leaving his Deathrite Shaman untapped, it's really challenging for Chris to get anything going game 1.
Yeah, now, fortunately, though, David making a pretty good play. It's a hedge against all of the Ponder decks. He makes a turn 2 Thalia instead, using Cavern of Souls to make it uncounterable. All the decks you mentioned, the Ponder decks, your Delver decks, possibly your Miracles decks even, your Sneak and Shows, they all don't really like seeing a Thalia on the other side.
And it's a nice, Cavern of Souls is a really nice inclusion to this deck as a result, because there's so many problematic humans between Thalia, Night of the Reliquary, Stoneforge Mystic, Mother of Runes, does some really good work, and a lot of decks struggle to beat some class of those cards, whether it's the anti-combo ones or the anti-beatdown ones.
Turn 2 Underground Sea into a Ponder for Chris. That does tip his hand a little bit, as you're now looking at Storm Reanimator. You're looking at combo decks almost exclusively.
It definitely narrows it down.
Night of the Reliquary, the next play for David. He does not have the land, but he uses the ability on Deathrite Shaman to make the 3rd mana for Night. He'll swing with Thalia and pass. And we go back to Chris's side. He's going to have to be quick here. We see Gaddock Teague in David's hand. That one not too strong as a lot of the cards in Reanimator. It does turn off Force of Will, however.
This is another edge that Hapless Researcher gives to Reanimator decks. I was about to say, Chris really can't go off through a Thalia this turn, because any discard spell, an Entomb, a Careful Study, that requires 2 mana, as does any reanimation spell. Hapless Researcher gives him a 1 mana way to start it off. And that could definitely come up here.
Yeah. You see in Chris's hand Gristlebrand and Tide Spout Tyrant. He's just going to make Polluted Delta and pass, deciding now is not the time to just yet go for it. He doesn't want any of his reanimation targets to get hit by Deathrite Shaman. We go back to McDarby. Thalia will attack again. Chris is at 15. As he's just going to play defense here, tapping the Savannah for 1 mana, sacrificing it to get a Wasteland. And Wasteland will hit Underground Sea. No response from Chris.
And it seems like Chris is not really functioning that well in the face of the Thalia. That being the case, makes a lot of sense for David to go to get a Wasteland. If Chris didn't do anything last turn, stands to reason he won't do anything next turn if he's down a mana.
Deathrite Shaman exiling a land to cast Gaddock Teague. And a lot of creatures hitting the table for David. Maybe that Thalia plus Deathrite Shaman was just enough pressure to stop Chris from comboing off. Thalia means Chris can't do it all in 1 turn, and if Chris tries to split up his combo over 2 turns, Deathrite Shaman becomes a pretty big problem.
This is a really impressive display by Maverick here, because David is causing all sorts of problems for Chris without even leaving Deathrite Shaman up. He's using it for mana, he's attacking. Just Thalia plus Mother Runes is trouble enough.
Yeah, no land, no play there for Chris. He passes, takes damage. Deathrite Shaman's the cast for David. Another Polluted Delta on Chris's side. You see, it's a lot. He's missing a couple pieces of the puzzle. You see multiple animate deads in his hand, multiple creatures. He has Tidespout Tyrant and Gristlebrand, but it's this Thalia that's doing the trick.
I really like the way that Chris is playing this. He could have spent a mana this turn deploying Hapless Researcher, but it's so unlikely that Chris can win this game, and the Hapless Researcher gives away everything. So I think there's some value here in probably taking the loss here, concealing the identity of your deck. Maybe David sideboards like your Storm based on the cards he's seen so far, and he doesn't bring in some anti-graveyard cards for game 2.
So, and there's even some issues here. Say David taps out, doesn't leave a Deathrite Shaman up, and Chris gets to Hapless Researcher, reanimate a Gristlebrand. It's not even clear if that's good enough to win right now.
It actually seems unlikely that's good enough because Chris is falling to a point now where he can't Gristlebrand the turn he plays it. He'd have to untap, and David would have to kind of cooperate to let Chris do anything with it.
It would really have to, I think, be Elesh Norn. It's the only creature that could recover him from this board. And Chris won't do it. He's kept under control by the Thalia. David's able to push more and more damage through, and game 1 goes to Maverick.
Even at the end of that game, Chris was very careful about the way he put the cards back into his hand. He picked up his lands and his ponders, put it in front of his hand, and then put his deck down. He is trying very hard to conceal the identity of his deck. David might have an inclination what's going on. Maybe he sat next to Chris and knows exactly what's going on. Based on the way that David played with the Deathrite Shaman, I suspect that's not the case. You know, David was a little liberal with it at a couple times making mana. And Chris might get an edge here in game 2 if David is not bringing in his anti-reanimator, anti-graveyard cards.
So you look at David here is looking at his sideboard, and he has 2 copies of Ethersworn Canonist and 2 copies of Containment Priest, and that's the difficulty. You know, is this Storm? Is this Reanimator? I think those are the 2 prime candidates.
Well, I think that you can kind of bring in both cards either way. They're not great, but you have some other, disruptive creatures in the deck that probably aren't good no matter what's going on. So I do think you have the option of bringing them in and hedging a little bit. The copies of Thoughtseize that David has in the sideboard are going to be really good here. He has a Nile Spellbomb, which can come in regardless of whether or not his opponent is Storm or Reanimator, so those are pretty safe to bring in. The same thing is possibly true of the Pithing Needle as well. But yeah. I think the 3 Thoughtseizes are no-brainers, no matter what you think Chris is playing. And the Containment Priest, Ethersworn Canonist, and Nile Spellbomb are cards that David can make room for, even if he's not totally certain what Chris is up to.
David does have a card like Choke in his sideboard, and I think that while that's tempting against a blue deck, because both Storm and Reanimator are on the faster end of combo decks, I imagine David will leave that one on the board.
I would not mess around with a Choke. I think that against either combo, Reanimator, Storm, whatever, it's just really unlikely that it's good.
All right, over on Chris Morris-Lent's side, he gets to have some removal for these hate bears that he expects out of David. He has 3 copies of Abrupt Decay in his deck. I would expect to see those ones come in. Also, this is a strong one, 2 copies of Massacre. You see that out of Reanimator sometimes, and that one will be very strong against David. And last one, and this is one I'm interested in. I don't know whether you can fight Maverick with creatures, but Chris has 2 copies of Pack Rat in his sideboard, which don't seem terrible here.
I think Pack Rat's sweet, especially on the play. You know, David's creatures are all about building up utility, building up a board. They're not really that big, pound for pound. With the exception of the Reliquary, they are quickly outclassed by Pack Rat, so I think that's a fine card to bring in here. There's also an Aetherling in Chris's sideboard, which I think is nice to bring in here because he needs some number of reanimation targets that he can bring in against an active Caracas. He has to respect that because David's playing with neither the Reliquary, so it's not just about David drawing the one Caracas. Neither Reliquary means that David has Caracas way more frequently.
So when you look at the creatures that Chris tries to reanimate in this strategy, the main deck always has 4 Gristlebrand, and those guys probably never leave. But then he has 6 different one-ofs. In the main, he has a Tidespout Tyrant, an Elesh Norn, and an Inkwell Leviathan. In the board, he has a Jin-Gitaxias Core Augur, an Iona, and a Sphinx of the Steelwind. So if you wanted, of those 6 creatures, if you had to have 3 in the matchup, which ones do we think are still in here?
I think that I would want this is tough. I would want, I think, the Tidespout Tyrant, the Elesh Norn, and the Aetherling.
All right, there's also the Aetherling here, so he has another option.
I like Aetherling a lot because it's a reanimation. It's a reanimation target that he can get against Caracas, and unlike Sphinx of the Steelwind, Inkwell Leviathan, Aetherling can play offense and defense.
Right.
And it's a challenging card for David to answer. You know, he's got creatures and spot removal. Aetherling is traditionally very good against that kind of plan.
So Aetherling's a great finisher. It attacks regardless, and it's proof against Caracas. Elesh Norn, if he can stick any creature on turn 1 or 2, Elesh Norn is pretty much the gold standard here, as it kills all of David's creatures.
It is good against everything that is not Knight of the Reliquary, so I think it's a good option to have.
Yeah, and then the last one here, we looked at Tide Spout Tyrant. Tell me more about that one. It's in his main deck.
I think that David just has enough, permanence of chunky casting costs that Tide Spout Tyrant is a pretty good target. If he can start chain together a couple spells in one turn, he can set David really far back. It's not like David's deck operates that well light on resources.
It's true. Maverick paying full cost for all its spells. Do you see here both players opting to go to 6 cards here. I do tend to agree. It's interesting how you have all these silver bullets in Reanimator, from Jin-Gitaxias to Iona against monocolored decks. Even something like Sphinx of the Steel Wind.
I think Sphinx is probably for some of the Delver matchups, I would guess.
Well, it gains life, right? So
yeah.
It's also not, I suppose, terrible against a burn-style strategy if I needed to reanimate something. But Gristlebrand already has lifelink.
And Iona is the check mark against any burn strategy.
Sure.
Sphinx is not a bad backup plan. I mean, you need to have a certain density of creatures in your deck to reanimate, so I think it's fine to bring in Sphinx of the Steel in. But Iona is the free win.
Yeah. Against monocolored strategies. That much makes sense.
I've never beaten an Iona. I've lost 100% of the time.
If you were playing a Hellspark Elemental build, you could still unearth them.
Because they can actually just deck you. They don't ever have to attack you if they don't want to. They can just deck you.
If you'd already resolved a Sulfuric Vortex.
Yes. Yeah, then you have then it's your Vortex against their Iona, which you might be able to win, depending on when the Iona
Yeah, that sounds
play.
really hard to beat an Iona.
It is true.
I have never beaten a resolved Iona with High Tide.
Yeah, it makes sense.
That's the only non-blue card is Candelabra. That doesn't cut it.
Not very helpful when you can't cast anything else.
We are underway. 6 cards apiece for Chris Morris-Lent and David McDarby. Match with what looks to be top 8 on the line. McDarby is up a game with Maverick here. And we'll start on a ponder. It'll be interesting to see how David is sideboarded. He locked Chris out of game 1, and Chris was very careful not to tip his hand and let David know just what strategy he was on.
And it looks like there is a Reanimate, a Massacre, and Abrupt Decay in hand right now.
You see Polluted Delta on top in those top 3 cards, so he does have at least one more land here. Animate Dead, the final card in Chris's hand. You're absolutely right. 2 reanimation spells, a Massacre and Abrupt Decay. So removal, check, reanimation, check, but he still needs a creature and a way to get into the yard. He maybe could find both in Entomb if he gets to one.
Yep.
Gotta be careful how he sequences this. He's gonna have to take 2 of these top 3 cards. And switches it around. Eventually takes the Polluted Delta for his hand.
So David has drawn Containment Priest, which means this is going to be, first of all, that he's at least guessing Reanimator is possible, and second, that this is going to be a tough game for Chris to win.
Yeah, because Containment Priest can be flashed in, it's very difficult for Chris to play around it, even though when he has a card like Abrupt Decay. Thalia was the play for David. And against a 2-land hand on Chris's side, Thalia may just lock Chris out for a second game.
Well, I think that Chris has a Massacre in hand right now and is just hoping he can get a little more out of David. He doesn't want to just get rid of the Thalia and have that be the end of it.
Right, there is a risk here because you see a Caracas moving to the front of David's hand. He can actually save his own Thalia from a Massacre if he leaves that card up. And actually, between Caracas and Thalia and Containment Priest, and I suppose this Deathrite Shaman, this is becoming a very difficult board for Chris to win through.
Well, he still has the out of just casting Massacre, having a counterspell for Containment Priest, and then he's fine. So even though it looks really bad right now, I think that Chris is not out of this game yet.
Absolutely. See a draw from Chris.
And Thalia only matters so much. It's not like he's playing Storm, where Thalia is very hard to beat.
He can win through it. He just needs He needs 4 or 5 lands to do it.
Or try to do everything in one turn.
Yeah, 4
Cast
or
a
5 to do it in
Massacre
one
and
turn.
then
Yeah.
dump out his hand.
He'll fetch. It's Tropical Island. The green in the deck, just for the Abrupt Decays out of the sideboard. How sweet of a draw would a Pack Rat be right here?
Without land number 3, not that good.
Okay, but you know.
Could get better.
Right. Okay. Without land, you're absolutely right. Without land 3, it's not very good. But I'm looking at the context of David's hand. I don't see a great way for him to answer Pack Rat if Chris Brainstorm's saying to Pack Rat land 3 here.
It's a slow burn, but it might be good enough to get it done.
Yeah.
Pack Rat, another discard outlet. Synergies abound.
Yeah,
in the
it's not just. He's going to brainstorm.
And this is a big win here for Chris because this Containment Priest has now been deployed, which means that Massacre gets everything.
Yes, David flashing in that Containment Priest. So maybe jumping the gun for McDarby here. We'll see if he gets punished. Chris will be happy to cast Massacre into this board.
Well, keep in mind, there's not even a promise if you're in
this
David's
card does
seat.
anything.
Yeah, he might be playing Storm. There still has not been a giveaway yet. The Tropical Island could easily be for a Xantid Swarm or Abrupt Decay out of a Storm deck.
Sure. 4th land for McDarby. He still has Stoneforge Mystic and an equipment left in hand. And he's deploying his last creature here. This is going to be quite a massacre.
I don't know if this is not on David's radar or he's already made the risk-reward assessment, but this is going to be a really good massacre.
It will be a massacre, you can say. David searching up equipment. He has one of his swords in hand. Let's see what else he wants to get. He's going to get Umezawa's Jete.
And now Chris just sitting here with his fingers crossed, hoping nothing bad happens to his swap before the turn ends.
Yeah, remember, David will be able to save his Thalia thanks to Caracas. Deathrite Shaman will exile the Ponder from Chris's graveyard, putting Chris down to 10. I mean, what David's he's looking to just win very quickly here. Possibly set up a lethal attack next turn.
I think with these lines of play, the casting of the Containment Priest, the aggressive use of Deathrite Shaman here, I think he thinks Chris is playing Storm.
Yeah, why not do that against a Storm player? And it's going to be Massacre from Chris. David's only response is to bounce Thalia. That's what he's going to do. And the rest of the creatures hit the graveyard. And the game firmly shifts over into Chris's favor with that play.
Yeah, Force of Will plus blue card left over, Reanimate.
Reanimate, Daze, Force of Will.
And now David's drawn Aethersworn Canoness, and that's, to me, the final piece of evidence that David didn't quite know what was going on and hedged a little bit.
Does Massacre tips the hand for you?
No, that could also be in
So
in
we still
Storm,
don't know.
Yeah.
This one does. How about Entomb?
All right, now we know.
All right.
Now we know.
10 step, 2-mana Entomb here for Chris. Well, David is going to get some information here. He's going to know what his opponent's playing, but he's going to pay an expensive price for that information. See, Tide Spout Tyrant, the choice for Chris Morris-Lent. And that's going to be a whole bunch of trouble. You see, he does have Reanimate in his hand, so it's going to come into play. It'll put him to a pretty low life total if he uses Reanimate.
But Tidesprout Tyrant being in play solves a lot of problems, even if your life total is a little low.
Yeah, Maverick's not a deck that can sneak damage into play very well. See David playing Aethersworn Canonist. And we'll go back over to Chris. The Entomb was in response, it looks like, to the Thalia. Right. Didn't want to crack his fetch land just yet. Here's land 4 from Chris. So tell me about going for Tidespout Tyrant. I would have offhand thought that you'd go for something like Elesh Norn in this matchup or something else to tide it over.
It's just because of the Caracas. He has to get something non-legendary.
Okay.
So
sure.
the Tidesprout Tyrant it's not a lock in this spot. Like Nellis Dorn would, but it's something he can keep in play. And if David makes a play here to try to put something into play, then Force of Will bounces something.
You see, back on Chris's side, he has a Reanimate and an Abrupt Decay. He's actually just going to pass back the turn. Doesn't want to use Reanimate on the Tidespout Tyrant.
Yeah, this is the big problem here. He's at 10 rather. If he reanimates, he goes to 2. He can't cast the Abrupt Decay in his hand. So unless David casts something before combat, allowing Chris to use the Force of Will, there's nothing for Chris to do. And in fact, he can't even do that play because he has to crack a fetched land and alternate cast Force of Will. So that's exact 0.
Yeah, if he reanimates Tidespout Tyrant, he's actually dead on the board. And that, to me, that's something which maybe Chris could have seen ahead of time with the Entomb play. You know, maybe you have to just Entomb Elesh Norn into that board. It's really hard to say. It's a tough spot for Chris.
Just try to keep playing Magic at 2. I think with nothing going on, that may not be a path to victory.
If Sphinx of the Steel Wind is in the deck, maybe you can go for that. It's a non-legendary creature with lifelink.
But I would be surprised if that card was
I
in
agree.
There. I mean, it's the most upside if Chris finds Exhume or some other, I guess, Animate Dead. It has to be Animate Dead because David can Exhume in the
Containment Priest. That card really has hurt the Reanimator strategy. It's great in this matchup.
Yep. Another really powerful hate bear. They've cranked out a lot of them lately.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Well, Containment Priest is not that good against the decks you typically play.
Usually not. Sometimes they have one creature in them. You know.
Sure.
He's jerk against those too. Sword of Fire and Ice into play. Chris down to 7. The Reanimate no longer any good here.
So if that sword connects, that means Chris would fall to 1, and then Force of Will and the fetch land are offline. That's probably enough to get a Force of Will out of Chris in this spot.
Looks like it will. Chris is going to crack fetch land here, go down to 6. Force of Will should put him to 5. He does have to pay for it because of Thalia. He'll pay. We'll see what he can get together. You're right, though. Animate Dead, really the card he's going to need right now. And he found something black.
It is Exhume.
As you mentioned before, it is good except for that Containment Priest in David's graveyard. That's going to match up very poorly for Chris.
Well, even setting aside the Containment Priest, Chris can't even really cast anything, and he's still at risk of just getting beaten to death.
Sure. Chris will go for Exhume. We have to pay 4 for it. This should be just fine for David.
Well, I think David's going to confirm with the judge of how exactly does this work. Does the Containment Priest stop something coming in from Exhume because it's coming in at the same time?
It's because it works with both show. Yeah, he's asking that question away from the table. Both Show and Tell and Exhume work in that they put creatures into play at the same time. So in the same way that Containment Priest is a hate card for Show and Tell, it's going to work against Exhume as well.
Okay. So David's going to get confirmation from the judge, and so will we momentarily.
I mean, even if you're Chris, maybe you don't, like, this is his play anyway. I don't think he has another line. And we'll just confirm ourselves here. Chris is going to get Tidespout Tyrant into play. And it's we'll see what
based on the way that David is contemplating this, I feel like the judge may have given him have gotten a different ruling here, because this would be a no-brainer if you could just get the Containment Priest and shut off this Exhume.
Yeah, possibly this doesn't work. Okay, so the ruling actually, we'll apologize here. The Containment Priest does not exile the Tide Spout Tyrant in the spot because I guess it did not see the Tide Spout Tyrant enter the battlefield, so its ability does not trigger in the situation. So Chris will get a Tide Spout Tyrant here. David's still choosing to get back Containment Priest here. Actually, it's Aethersworn Canonist is the second card he chose. So we'll go back to McDarby. He's going to have to face down a Tide Spout Tyrant. Now with Chris at 5, it's not impossible for him to get through this.
But he has to be very careful about casting spells now because any counter spell he unleashes in Chris's hand is not just a counter spell, it's a boomerang as well.
Yeah, it's not out of the woods for Chris. He's not safe to attack here, and I think that's one of the key things.
If he gets a second legendary creature into play, then he can start attacking, Caracasing the one that gets blocked, and recasting.
Looks like it's going to be Knight of the Reliquary among the remaining cards in David's hand. He also has a copy of Umezawa's Jitte. And actually, it's Green Sun Zenith. That was his draw for the turn, so he may have a nice option of different creatures to get here. He'll go for Green Sun Zenith on X equals 3. See if Chris has a counter for it.
Yeah, this is X's 2 through the Thalia.
All right, so he gets a 2-drop. Looking at that, his options, Gaddock Teague, Scavenging Ooze, Kasali Pride Mage, Deathrite Shaman. Scavenging Ooze is traditionally a great card in this matchup. But on this board, it's going to be Gaddock Teague.
I think it's possible David is just interested in locking out as many of these spells that Chris can play as possible. A second legendary creature also frees David up to start attacking, Caracasing the one that gets blocked, and then replaying. So he needs a secondary legendary creature, which alongside his Caracas lets him start to get something going.
Yeah, it's a little too late for Scavenging Ooze here. And Reanimate is going to be the target here for Chris. Remember, Reanimate can target both graveyards. He's going to have to pay 2 for it, tapping, so 2 mana remains. He needs the trigger off the Tide Spout Tyrant while he's making the play. Reanimate can go with either graveyard. He'll bounce Aethersworn Canonist, and he'll reanimate David's own Deathrite Shaman. That's a way for Chris to gain some life back.
Yes. And he only takes 1 off the reanimate, which is really nice too.
Chris down to 4. So we go back over to David McDarby's turn, drawing another copy of Containment Priest. That one's a turn too late to get the Deathrite Shaman, but still will be pretty good. There's a lot of reanimation in Chris's deck. And David, interesting choice. He can swing both creatures and push that 2 damage like you mentioned, or he can continue to develop his board here.
He may be able to do both. For example, if he attacks with both, he can Caracas the one that gets blocked by the Tyrant back to his hand, recast it, and still have the mana left over to play Containment Priest at instant speed.
See if that's what David chooses to do. Tough match here for Chris Morris-Lent, down a game. He has finally got some reanimation to resolve. He got his Tide Spout Tyrant onto the board, but he only has 4 life. Stabilizing being pretty difficult against a deck that can actually just swarm you with 2/2s. Looks like he's going to start on Aethersworn Canonist.
And I like going down this road here for David. I don't think there's much merit in trying to get the Jitte into play because the Tide Spout Tyrant gets to block whatever the Jitte goes on, and plus whatever Tide Spout Tyrant trigger can also bounce either the creature or the Jitte. So flooding the board with creatures makes a lot of sense here. So Chris still in a problematic spot here. And there aren't really that many cards he can effectively deploy here at instant speed. You know, David doesn't have to play around that many Tide Spout Tyrant triggers.
Yeah, Umezawa's Jite play here. You see, he's just trying to put together a 4-point attack. And for 3, Chris can not only daze the Umezawa's Jite, but he can bounce a permanent.
And I wonder if there's an argument here for David to start using the knight to try to wasteland Chris out while nothing's going on here. It's a slow process, but the board is kind of, as long as there's a lot of mana available on Chris's side, it's always going to be harrowing for David to make an alpha strike.
Yeah, because of Thalia, he can start to tax Chris's mana. Maybe that way he can, like, if he stops Chris's ability to bounce permanents, he helps set up a good attack for himself.
Again, I'm not totally sure because the Wasteland line takes so long to get set up. But neither player really in a position to go anywhere just yet, so.
McDarby's going to do just that. Gets a copy of Wasteland. The days will bounce Knight of the Reliquary. Pays the extra mana, 4 days. Umezawa's Jite resolves. Chris still at 4. He does have a Bayou up. He'll be able to gain 2 off the Stoneforge Mystic that is still in David's graveyard. Though not too many creatures. Chris won't be able to go too high on life totals. He's going to get the Containment Priest first. So there's 1 creature remaining in graveyards.
And this Deathrite Shaman does, given enough time, give Chris enough life where Reanimate becomes a viable option again.
We go back to Chris's turn. 5th land is Polluted Delta. We'll give him some insurance against wastelands. But what Chris needs to figure out is how does he make progress here? How does he get closer to winning? Maybe he's not losing at the moment, but he's not able to do any damage.
The thing is, it's just so risky for David to pull the trigger on an attack, because the Spout Tyrant is an eligible blocker, and if Chris has spells to play, the attack collapses. So Chris does get a little bit of time, most likely, to draw out of this, just out of respect for, on David's side of the table, the respect you have to have for Chris's ability to make life very challenging for you if you go for a big attack.
You go back, Deathrite Shaman was the draw for McDarby. And he's got Chris covered in a lot of ways. If you think about how Chris gets through this board, I think eventually a winning game plan for Chris has an Elesh Norn worked into it somewhere to just sweep up this stuff. But because of the Containment Priest, Chris has to first kill it before he were to get a card like Elesh Norn into play.
There's a lot of different things that, Chris has to access here to be able to get out from under this. But
Deathrite Shaman will get rid of the last creature in graveyards, puts Chris up to 8. We pass back. David did make his own, just recast Knight of the Reliquary that turn.
The upshot of all of this, what's going well for Chris, is David's in a holding pattern, and in the meantime, Chris gets a draw step and gets to gain 2 life off of his Deathrite Shaman. So he has a little bit of time. You can see he's sitting on what appears to be an Entomb, which gives him 1 instant speed bounce spell.
Yeah, he has Entomb. Yeah, he's draw for turn looks like it's an Iona. So as long as Containment Priest is in play, that's not going to do much for him. A whole slew of creatures on David's side. He has Aethersworn Canonist, Containment Priest, Gaddock Teague, Knight of the Reliquary. He has a copy of Umezawa's Jite.
And also, because of the Canonist, this 2 spells in 1 turn thing is pretty awkward. And that's a line of play that David can set up here. If he gets a second Canonist into play, then he knows the ceiling on Chris's spells is 1.
And David is just going to flood the board, plays his own copy of Deathrite Shaman, plays a second Aethersworn Canonist. And this Deathrite Shaman is going to be pretty potent. It does 2 a turn to Chris, so it's a way to push damage through.
Well, the big thing here is unless Chris has something like Echoing Truth, David can now confidently make an Alpha Strike next turn because The worst case, assuming that there's no copy of Echoing Truth, the worst thing that Chris can do on an Alpha Strike is bounce one Aethersworn Canonist, and that's his spell for the turn.
Absolutely. So we see David's going to go for a Wasteland. In response, Chris will Entomb. He uses his trigger to bounce the Deathrite Shaman, seeing that that's the card that's going to kill him the quickest. But you're right, these Aethersworn Canonists really do tie Chris's hands. And it's because there's two of them. It's not like Chris can lead on an Abrupt Decay and then continue to cast spells.
Yep.
He will be spelled out the first time.
So now with the Deathrite Shaman not in play, this is a window to get Elisnorn, as you mentioned before. And this might turn the game around very quickly because I don't think David has the source to Plowshares. Yes, he has the Caracas for the Aethersworn Canonist, but this is a fairly quick clock.
Yeah, well, Chris will need to get rid of the Containment Priest first before he gets the Elishnor into play. So there are some steps, but you're right. If Chris can get both those things to happen,
you know, there's
that will
other
work pretty
copies.
well.
There's Abrupt Decays. There's some copies of there's one copy of Massacre left. Not inconceivable for him to get out of this still.
Time is not on his side, though. As soon as David gets to replay that Deathrite Shaman, he'll be able to exile Elishnorn from the graveyard. And with only one copy in the 75, once that Elishnorn's exiled, Chris's best weapon is no longer in his deck.
There's also the risk of David just getting to a position where he can confidently Alpha Strike.
Yeah, I think if Chris doesn't win soon, David will be able to win, whether that's through an Alpha Strike, a Deathrite Shaman. I think there's a lot of different lines to doing it.
Or even just the Knight of the Reliquary getting too big. He also has the option now of just getting the Knight past the point where Tidespout Tyrant can block it and just saying, all right, attack you. Do you have something? If not, you're chump blocking.
Chris can shrink it once a turn with Deathrite Shaman, but you're absolutely right. The Knight can beat up a Tidespout Tyrant given enough time.
And now David transitioning to starting to cut off some of Chris's mana.
Yep, wastes Chris off his final green mana source. That'll force Chris to leave up that polluted delta, so in case he draws an Abrupt Decay, he'll be able to use it. And a lot of lands starting to pile up in David's graveyard. Knight of the Reliquary, pretty big here. 1, 2, 3, 4 lands in the yard. Knight is a 6/6 currently. That's just big enough to get past Tidespout Tyrant.
And this is the type of spot where, you know, David's got a lot going on and he's just trying to be extra cautious.
Deathrite Shaman the play here. David at any point could sacrifice this Verdant Catacombs to get Knight to a 7/7. It's not lethal, but it's getting pretty close. David sacks the fetch land. Knight grows to 7/7. It's land here. Impressive display here from Maverick, he's done such a good job. It took Chris so many turns to finally assemble a combo that got a creature into play. And at that point, David has been able to continue to put pressure on the board. So even once Chris resolved a reanimation target, it really wasn't enough.
Yeah. Caracas really creates the problems for Reanimator. You know, it just cuts off so many lines of attack, and then you have to go to these secondary options. Also on display, there are a lot of good 2-cost creatures for disrupting combo decks in Legacy.
Right. You see Containment Priest, Gaddock Teague, Thalia, and Aethersworn Canonist all in play at the same time here.
All the hits.
And I think this should cut off some of Chris's last outs here. If once Deathrite Shaman exiles Elishnorn, I don't see how Chris. I suppose he has one copy of Massacre left, so that is an out for him. Well, it doesn't deal with the Knight, but he can bounce the Knight with it. It gives him some play.
Yep.
David going to take his turn here. If a Massacre is going to happen on Chris's side, it's going to have to be drawn this turn. Unclear if Chris even gets to survive through this turn. There's a lot of creatures on David's side. David will pass, choosing to slowly choke both players out of lands.
This is the other option. He can, as you mentioned, just sit back on this Deathrite Shaman and try to win the game that way.
Reanimate. going to be exiled out of Chris's yard. Chris to deal 2 to David.
And no reason for David to initiate a fight over that. He can always, at the end of Chris's turn, use the Deathrite Shaman. If Chris wants to respond with his own Deathrite Shaman activation, that's fine. He's down a mana, and now there's fewer permutations of cards he has to worry about.
Yeah, and he's down a blocker too, which is starting to look pretty relevant here. With only 1 blocker, Chris will likely take 8. But that's why you don't see Chris taking damage right now. He is defensively using his Deathrite Shaman to hold off David's Deathrite. David continues to push forward. Swamp was the draw for Chris. Puts 1 into play. Knight of the Reliquary now finally starts attacking. Deathrite Shaman is going to block and exile.
And that's a great sign there for David. There was no trick up Chris's sleeve. He just immediately went ahead and chump blocked, meaning his hand's pretty soft, probably does not have that much play to it.
And Knight of the Reliquary was a 9/9 there, so that guy's lethal in 1 swing. Chris draws a card, but it's Entomb. It is not going to help him here. Deathrite knocks Chris down to 6.
And even with a Sideboarding Tyrant activation here, there's just so many 2/2s trucking on in that I don't think Chris can stop everything.
Looks to be the story. Chris down to 6. Just losing his lands. And with so many different hate bears in play, just unable to put together the pieces he needs to. Swing of Knight of the Reliquary. Chris is going to Entomb here to bounce the Knight. Tide Spout Tyrant ability triggers. Knight goes back to David's hand. Chris will be alive for another turn. Chris gets to Entomb. Almost doesn't matter what creature he puts in the yard, as it's just fodder for Deathrite Shaman.
I feel like David probably would have been well served making an Alpha Strike there, just because you know Chris has Massacre in the deck. There's not a hammer lock on this game. Things can still go wrong.
Yeah, at some point, I mean, David's playing this like a control deck, right? He's playing it as though he's just going to cut off all of Chris's outs. And because Massacre is a card he's seen, he actually doesn't have a way to cut off that out yet. I think he's got all the other ones covered at the moment, outside of running Abrupt Decays. But even then, that's a lot of turns off. Only 1 copy of Massacre left, though. Chris didn't draw it that turn.
So yeah, you have 5 eligible attackers against 1 blocker. 1 spell bounces 1 thing. So you're at basically just echoing Truth as Chris's way is to survive this attack.
Yeah.
He has to block both candidates to get out of this.
And only 2 creatures need to get through.
Yeah.
And that will not do it. David McDarby 2-0 defeats Chris Morris-Lent, comes off a tough loss to Sultai, and rallies back at 7-1 in a great spot to make the top 8 here.
Yeah, should be in a position to draw. David was very cautious there, but you can see all the different elements of Maverick on display, able to interact with, creatures coming in with reanimation effects, with containment priest.
Yeah, and actually, to be fair, David actually has the Massacre out covered. Going back, we didn't realize Gaddock Teague is actually one of the hate bears in play. Massacre is a 4-mana spell, even though he's going to cast it for 0.
But Chris can still chain together Abrupt Decay plus X.
Yeah.